My name is Liliana, and I have been working as a nurse in a hospital for 35 years. Over the decades, I've seen life in all its fragile forms. I've witnessed miracles, held the hands of the dying, and shared in the joy of new lives entering the world. I thought I understood life and death. But one day, something extraordinary happened that changed my perspective forever. It was an ordinary day at the hospital. I was on my usual rounds, checking on patients, administering medications, and offering words of comfort. But as the hours dragged on, I began to feel unwell. A searing pain erupted in my chest, and before I could call for help, everything went black. When I regained awareness, I wasn't in the hospital anymore. Instead, I found myself in a radiant place filled with a sense of peace that words cannot adequately describe. It wasn't a dream. It felt too vivid, too real. Standing before me was a figure bathed in light. Though I couldn't make out his features clearly, I knew without a doubt that it was Jesus. "Liliana," he said, his voice gentle yet commanding, "you have been faithful in your work, but there is something I need to show you." In an instant, images flashed before my eyes. I saw people, millions of them, crying out in desperation, their prayers rising like smoke. Some were hungry, others were sick, and many were lost in despair. I felt their pain, as if it were my own. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Because you need to understand the power of fasting," Jesus replied. "Fasting is not just an act of self-denial. It is a profound spiritual tool that aligns your spirit with my will. When you fast, you humble yourself, allowing me to work through you in ways you cannot comprehend." I was stunned. As a nurse, I'd always thought of fasting in purely physical terms, something related to health or medical procedures. But this was different. Jesus was talking about fasting as a bridge between heaven and earth, a way to break chains and bring about transformation. "But Lord," I said, "I don't understand. How can something as simple as fasting make such a difference?" Jesus smiled. "When you fast with the right heart, you deny the flesh and feed the spirit. It's not about the act itself, but the intention behind it. Fasting, combined with prayer, can move mountains. It can heal the sick, bring comfort to the grieving, and even change the course of nations." As he spoke, I saw more images. A family reconciled after years of bitterness, a child healed of a terminal illness, a community restored after a devastating disaster. In each scene, fasting and prayer were at the heart of the transformation. "Liliana, I am sending you back," Jesus said. "But you must share this truth with others. Teach them the power of fasting. Show them that through humility and faith, they can experience my presence and my miracles." Before I could respond, the radiant light faded, and I found myself back in the hospital. I was surrounded by doctors and nurses, their faces filled with relief. I had been unconscious for several minutes, but to me, it felt like I had been gone for hours. That day marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I began studying fasting from both a spiritual and medical perspective, understanding its benefits for the body and the soul. I shared my experience with colleagues, patients, and anyone willing to listen. Some were skeptical, but many were inspired to try it for themselves. One patient, Maria, was battling severe depression. She decided to try fasting and prayer after hearing my story. Over time, her mental health improved, and she found a renewed sense of purpose. Another patient, James, who was struggling with addiction, experienced a breakthrough after incorporating fasting into his spiritual journey. As I reflect on that extraordinary encounter, I am filled with gratitude. Jesus revealed a truth that not only deepened my faith, but also gave me a new way to serve others. Fasting is more than abstaining from food. It is a sacred act of surrender, a way to invite God's power into our lives. Now, I no longer see my work as just a job. Every patient I care for is an opportunity to share hope, to remind them that they are not alone, and to encourage them to seek God in their struggles. And every time I fast, I am reminded of that day when Jesus revealed the shocking truth that changed my life forever. It was an ordinary day at the hospital. I was on my usual rounds, checking on patients, administering medications, and offering words of comfort. The steady rhythm of the hospital's activity provided a comforting hum in the background. Nurses bustled about, machines beeped softly, and the low murmur of conversations filled the air. Everything seemed normal, predictable even. But as the hours dragged on, I began to feel unwell. It started as a faint ache in my chest, one I initially dismissed as fatigue or indigestion. After all, long shifts and missed meals were part of the job. I'd been through worse and powered through countless days like this. But this time, the ache grew sharper, evolving into a searing pain that demanded my attention. I paused in the middle of the corridor, leaning against the wall for support. My breathing became shallow, each inhale feeling like an effort. A colleague passed by and asked if I was all right. I nodded, unwilling to admit that something might be seriously wrong. I told myself it would pass. It had to pass. There were still patients to care for. As I resumed walking, the world around me seemed to blur. My vision narrowed, my legs wobbled, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. Panic began to creep in, but before I could call for help or even process what was happening, everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by familiar faces wearing expressions of concern. Dr. Patel, one of my closest friends and colleagues, was seated at my bedside. "Welcome back," she said softly, relief evident in her tone. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and my voice came out as a croak. Dr. Patel handed me a glass of water and waited patiently as I took a sip. "What happened?" I finally managed to ask. Dr. Patel's expression turned serious. "You had a heart attack," she said. The words hit me like a freight train. "It's a good thing you collapsed where you did. The team was able to act quickly. We've placed a stent, and you're going to need to rest and make some changes." A heart attack? Me? The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my career caring for others, often urging patients to prioritize their health while neglecting my own. The long hours, stress, and lack of sleep had finally caught up with me. The days that followed were a whirlwind of recovery and reflection. As a patient in the same hospital where I worked, I experienced the other side of healthcare. The nurses who had been my colleagues became my caretakers, their kindness and professionalism leaving me humbled. Each test, each procedure, each word of encouragement. I saw it all through new eyes. I also had time to confront the truths I'd been avoiding for years. My body had given me warnings, subtle ones at first, then more insistent, but I'd ignored them, convinced that I was invincible, that I could push through anything. Now, lying in that hospital bed, I realized how fragile life truly is. As my strength returned, so did my resolve. I made a promise to myself that things would be different. I would find balance, prioritize my health, and lead by example, not just for my patients, but for my family, my friends, and myself. Weeks later, when I returned to work, I did so with a new perspective. The hospital was the same, bustling with life and urgency, but I was different. I took breaks, ate meals, and leaned on my colleagues when I needed help. And when I spoke to my patients about the importance of self-care, I did so with the conviction of someone who had lived the consequences of neglecting it. Life at the hospital continued, but for me, every day was no longer ordinary. It was a gift, one I vowed never to take for granted again.